Yeah. Hi. Sorry. So most of you have already attended those first two sessions. I'm expecting that, and then afterwards, or you understand those concepts. So let's start with the third session, which will be related to classes and objects. So considering classes and objects, this is not a new concept. I don't think this will be a new concept for any one of us because most of us have worked with at least one of the object-oriented programming languages. But let's discuss few stuffs. So this is the agenda for today's session. That first we will discuss what is OOPS, then why we need OOPS in this particular in this I can say in the programming paradigms and also sort of stuff. Then we will discuss about how classes and objects are used in Ruby. Then we will discuss what are classes and instance methods and how they are differ from each other. Then there are access specifiers that we predominantly used in Ruby, and then there will be getters and setters. So let's dive into the first topic then. Yeah. So oops. So most of us already known that we have shifted from a procedure oriented to object oriented. So let's first discuss what is OOPS. So ideally, as a definition, I would say like OOPS is like so by name it's just a object-oriented paradigms, but ideally it means like considering everything as an object. That means considering everything as a some unique, I would say like distinct entity with some properties as well as some actions to it. Like let's say in real life examples, let's take an example of your mobile phone, or let's take an example of this laptop as well. Because we can consider this laptop a object, and then it has its own features, I would say like attribute sort of stuff, and it has its own action to perform any certain tasks. So this is kind of a way object oriented paradigms works. So there are few I can say that since I am saying paradigms all the time, so that means it has some certain standardized to rules or something sort of stuff, or standard properties I can say. So few of them I have listed here, the major ones I can say. The first one is encapsulation. So encapsulation is nothing but like binding those two things that we were discussed earlier. Like there is a data that is the features or any sort of stuff, and then there will be some actions that they can perform. So binding those two together such that for a outer entity like a current user, consider this a laptop. So for a outer user, it's just a single entity, but inside it, it's encapsulated within one another such a way that they are complementing each other. So that's kind of in a shortly detail of encapsulation. The second point is polymorphism. So polymorphism, as a name suggests, is a poly, that means multiple, and morphism means I can say the naming structures or something that. So ideally, what I would say like the having a similar name but having different properties to it, different I can say the actions to it. So this is widely used as in the scenarios where we need similar sort of actions from for different sort of objects of a same class, and what we want like to behave differently in those different cases. So in those cases what we do, we have either there are two types of polymorphism as well. You might have already known, that is compile time polymorphism as well as runtime polymorphism. So at a compile time means like at a compile time it decides for which objects which methods to be used, whereas in runtime it will decide like depending upon the I can say the classes, the hierarchies, it will decide like which methods to be used for a certain object. Then there is a next topic, that is inheritance. So inheritance is kind of a how can I define it? How can let's take an example of a I can say laptops. Let's take an example of a laptop. There are different sort of systems as well. What we do, there is a let's consider there is a all laptops will be considered as a part of a single class. Afterwards, what we do, there will be different classes for each sort of systems as per the requirements. Like if we consider a Windows system, a Linux system, as well as a Mac system, so these three will be different from each other in certain aspects, but they're similar in certain aspects, like to perform certain actions. So what we do in inheritance, we inherit those properties from a parent class. So it's kind of a why do we use like parent and child? So that analogy actually works. Like if there is a parent and it has I can say the multiple childs. So what they do, they have those all three are unique in their own ways, but they have inherited properties from their parents as well. So in the similar constraint, the inheritance works here. Then the last one, that is abstraction. So it's kind of similar. Most of the time, what happens, like people confuse between encapsulation and abstractions. So what usually abstraction does is that in it's mostly work with like giving just the needed details, like just inputs and outputs for a particular functions, whereas it's hiding its implementation part. In encapsulation as well, we are hiding it, but we are hiding along with the binding as well. So in abstraction, we more or less work with hiding of the implementation of the details. Yeah. So this is a, in a shorter way, I can say this is oops. Now the bigger question, like why we need oops. There has been like most of us know, like it started with C, then it started with assembly language and sort of stuff, then it comes to C, which is a procedure oriented language, and then we shifted to oops. Then why so that might be the question that it comes to everybody's mind, like why we needed that shift from procedure oriented to object oriented paradigms. So I would, in briefly I can say, like as we have already discovered, like considering everything as an object in a unique way. So it helps us doing different sort of things, like we have a data, we have its action depend on our own idea. In procedure oriented, what was used to happen, like we what the data and the actions are nowhere near, like if you are declaring something integer or something sort of stuff, we had only the basic data types. We never had a chance to define our own data types and use it as a standard blueprint to design something on that. So that's, I can say, the biggest advantage over here. And so let's take an example for this as well. So as I earlier stated, like for a bigger company, let's take our company. So if we consider, like if you need to design a directory structure for complete company, so what you need to do in procedure oriented languages, you will use structures sort of stuff. Whereas in structures, what we it will do, like it will have some actions that we need to give to employees. Some certain actions will be there for the admins, certain actions will be needed for I can say the higher management and sort of stuff. But if you code it in procedure oriented sort of stuff, in that way what will happen, like at every step you need to have that checks need to be performed, that is this particular action allowed to that particular role. But this is actually not feasible, right? So what we need to understand in this particular scenario, that if we are considering, if we design same thing using object oriented, what we'll have, we will have a certain set of features of admin different from higher management, different from employee, and we can have actions associated with it as well. So internally, it will handle all the stuff, like which actions are allowed to which objects and sort of stuff. That's why we need oops in this sort of cases. Okay, so this is predominantly the reasons why we shifted from I can say the procedure oriented to the oops. There are certain anomalies to that as well. You can explore that on in your free times, I can say. Yeah. So let's start with the next one, like how classes and objects are used. So already let's first discuss what are classes and objects, and then we will discuss like how that's actually been used in Ruby. First is class. So classes, like as I earlier stated, like it's a kind of a structure that's, I can say, the custom structure that we can define to have to use that to declare any object sort of stuff. So object is nothing but like a instance of that structure that we already used. So classes has different stuff, like you can see here, classes can have its own, as in this particular example, we have state, that is actually the property, or we can say the data part of the class. Then there will be functions, that will be the method or action sort of part. So in, those who are, come from, might be those who are already used like Java or CPP sort of stuff. So what you can see, like it's kind of different from that particular structure. We don't have like any parenthesis sort of stuff. In this, what we do, we usually work in blocks. You already might have discussed this thing in the last session, like what are methods and blocks. So you can see here, like what we do, we are just using a class at I can say the keyword that is actually similar to most of the languages that are in that are currently in the market. So class, then I named it as a Josh. So this is kind of a I can say the standard way that we usually have a camel case structure to name a particular class. Whereas if you see, like while naming a method, I am using snake case. So what is the difference between a snake case and camel case is that in camel case, what will you do? You will have a capitalized letter to start of any word. You don't use any spaces sort of stuff because that's not allowed. In snake cases, what we do, we have all the letters in the lower case, whereas for you in spaces, uh, instead of spaces we will use underscores. So this is actually the difference between naming structure, naming a snake case and the camel case. And ideally we use camel case for classes, whereas for that for definitions or the methods we will use snake cases. So you can see here, this is a small example of a class. Like we have defined a class called Josh. That's actually the name of the company. So we have first the constructor that is initialized. So what we did, we initialized it with a state with a default value like hi. You can say it in any fashion, like what is it and how we should use it. Then we have define a method that will be the action part, like say. So what it will do, it will just use that state and it will print out this particular phrase like, and how's the Josh, hi sir. You can see here it's quite similar to others other programming languages as well. Like we are using new method to create an object out of a class. So with new, you can see here like we have created a class with this unique ID. So you can see here like every class, every object will have IDs. So understand that stuff. Then there will be state. So state is, since we have given the default value, that's why the state has been given here. Then we can call using dot operator directly, that a dot say. And so this is a pretty much similar structure to most of the object-oriented languages. So if you still feel like it's different from your ones, you can check like how it's why it is differ from that. I am pretty sure like it will be better than your current language. That's pretty sure. Yeah. So the next one is, this is a new thing, like class methods versus instance methods. Most of you might have used similar methods in most of the cases. Like you don't have this sort of concept in most of the languages. How these things are different from one another. So I have given two examples here. Like first one is the a class method, and second one is the instance method. So those who have already gone through like CPP or Java, they might have known, or Python as well. Like we have a static methods, right? They might have used like static methods. So this is kind of similar way to static methods as well, the class methods. Whereas instance methods are normally the normal methods that we use. So how they differ from each other? As name suggests, a class method can be directly called using class name. And whereas an instance method needs an instance of that particular class to call that method. So you can see here in the first example, we have declared a class Josh with self.say. So it will, it is saying that this is a way how we declare a class method. So there is other way like, as well, like you can directly replace this self with class name as well. But why to use the same name again and again? So that's why we can use the self keyword. So define self.say. Then we have the same ones like method that how the session hyphen, and then we have ended the class. So while calling that particular method, you can see here I'm directly using the class name. I'm not I have not created any sort of objects to it. You can see here, and it's not giving any sort of error. Whereas in instance method, you can see here we have a normal class called circle with a constructor method which will accept a radius, and then we have an instance method. So instance method are a normal methods like get area, which will give us which will return us the area. So you might have seen like we haven't used any return sort of keyword here. So Ruby has a way like the last line will be if you doesn't define like where to return. So by default, it will take last line as a return statement. So that's why we don't need to use that return statement again and again. If you have, we know that the last line will be returned. Last line, whatever the value at the last line will need to be returned. Okay. So you can see here, like after the class declarations, what we did, we have created a object of a circle class with the initial value of 2, and then we have called that method called get area. So you might have wondering like why do we need these sort of two methods. So first what I would say, like there are certain cases where you don't your methods or certain sort of stuff doesn't depend on any sort of instance values. You can see here like the get area is dependent on the initial value set by while initializing an instance, that is the radius. Whereas in the first example, that it doesn't depend on any sort of whatever object you need to declare, you can it doesn't depend on that. So that's why we declared it as a class based method. So ideally, in what cases we can use class methods in where you need report of all the objects or count sort of stuff, which will not be dependent on particular objects. So in that cases, you can use the class methods. So you can explore this one with a nominal stuff like any sort of assignments, like where you are having certain actions which are dependent on instances, where certain actions are dependent on which doesn't depend on a particular instance. In that cases, you can use the class and instance methods. And there is one more thing as well, like as you already as we discussed, like there are two things where you can explore it on your own as well, like similar to class methods and instance methods, we have class variables and instance variables as well. So how they differ, like you might have known, like there is a scope, every variable has a scope, right? So what is right, if you declare certain variable inside a function, so that's the scope of that particular variable will be within the function only. Whereas if you declare something globally, it will be it will be retained until that program gets terminated. Similar case happen here as well. In class variables, you can retain that values until that particular program gets terminated. Whereas in instance methods, that particular scope is dependent on that particular instances that you are having. Okay, so you can explore these things, like how class methods and instance method differ from one another. Class variables and instance variables are different from each other. Okay, and if you get doubts, you can search it as well, and you can contact anybody from company. So that's the best way. Then the next topic that we have, access specifier. So you might have used this sort of stuffs like public, private sort of keywords in other object-oriented language as well. If you don't, so as it names as a, so it defines the accesses that a particular thing has allowed or something sort of stuff. So we can see here from the example as well, like what we did, we have declared a class called Josh with public keyword. So this is actually a pretty much syntax that if you want to perform access define access specifiers, what you do, you can just define that as, if you define a public one, below that whatever is there, it will be considered as public until unless there is another access specifier. Okay, so and by default most of the most of the methods that we define are public. Okay, if you don't use any keyword, we generally don't use keywords for public because by default those are public. Okay, so for now I have used here the with class Josh in public. What I did, I just had a define method say, which has put tests as I am enjoying. I have called say internally, which is a private method. Okay, and in private, what I did due to the great mentors. So what happens in there, when I created a object of that particular class, that is Josh.new, and I called a.say, it's executing perfectly, saying I am enjoying, which is the first line in that particular function, and whereas a second line from the second function, as we have called that from that function. That's why. But when, yeah, sorry. So, but we can say, like if we try to call a.say internally, it's giving us an error because the private methods are not accessible to instances. Okay, so private methods are mostly used for internal use of within that particular class. You can see here, like I have already used that private method in another method, but when I try to access that from outside, it's giving me an error. So this is the access specifier that we use. Okay, then the last one, getters and setters. So first question might first thing that that might be in your head, like why do we need getters and setters? So you can try, like without using this particular getter, that is define name, which will return the name. You can, if you try to directly access the name like that, like company.name, it will give an, what it will give, it will allow you to say that particular name, or it will give an error. You can try that on your own. So getters and setters are mostly used because since I already stated with while discussing the object oriented paradigms as well, that A class is a structure, a closed encapsulated structure. That is what it is. And object is also a instance of that particular class only. So that's why when you try to access something which is already internally encapsulated, it will give an error. But you, so we use getters and setters to access those internal details, so that we have a control what data needs to be is allowed to be fetched from outside or what it is not. Yeah, so that is getters. And similarly the setters one as well. So as I earlier stated that it doesn't allow you to perform certain things like fetching. Similar to that, it will not allow to update things from outside. So to give them that access, we have defined a public method here. You can see here. So if I have mentioned this getter and setters as a private, it will not work. So have that in mind. If you are using some getters and setters, use public methods for it. Okay. Yeah. So I guess that's the pretty much that we needed to discuss today. So if you have any doubts, you can connect to any Ruby developers that are in the company. Yeah. So just a minute.